I'm Paul with Builder Bust, and today I'm going to show you how to make this crosscut sled with the miter jig. I decided to use melamine because of how sturdy it is, it's inexpensive, and I like that the finish is very durable. Also, you can write on it too, which is kind of cool. I started with a full sheet, and then I cut that down to a manageable size so that way I could take it into the shop. I then figured out how big I wanted to make the sled and cut it down to size. Now make sure to wear your PPE anytime you're cutting anything as well, especially melamine. When cutting this stuff, it sends off little pieces of shrapnel that can do some pretty serious harm, and I don't want to hear that Paul's video made me lose my eyesight, so make sure to be safe. Once I had the base of the sled cut out, it was time to figure out what to do for the front fence. Since I happen to have a lot of walnut from the mill right now, I thought, why not? It's pretty to look at and will most likely inspire some creativity on a regular basis. I ripped the cutoff board into two and glued them together and let that set up. After everything was dry, I squared the sides up on the table saw and then took it over to the miter saw to clean up the ends. Now the front fence was cut to the correct size and ready to move forward. For this design, I decided to utilize the Craig swing stop. I was thinking of making one of Jay Bates' homemade stop blocks, but I had a coupon for this and I do love Craig tools. In order to accommodate the track into the front fence, it is necessary to cut a 3/4 by 3/4 inch rabbet out of the length of the piece. This is mistake number one. Doing it again, I would have simply cut one of those pieces down prior to glue up. I would have just made it 3/4 inches narrower. However, you'll see later I'm glad to have these cutoffs. With the notch cut out, I could then align the Craig track. As always, I pre-drill the pilot holes and secure them with the included screws that came with the track. Now it is time to decide what I'm going to do with the rear fence. I figured I'd simply use the same style as most other crosscut fences, with a high spot in the middle and then sloping off to the sides. It's a classic look and it saves on weight without sacrificing the strength. I then took it over to my 1937 bandsaw and realized it still needs a ton of work and it didn't fix itself in the last month. But hey, it was worth a try. Jigsaw to the rescue! After cutting out the design, I then stepped over to the oscillating sander to smooth everything out and give it its final shape. I really need to tune up my bandsaw. Hey, maybe that'll be another video. With the fences being completed, I figured I'd move on to getting the T-slot tracks installed. I aligned the base of the sled on the table saw, got it centered, and then I turned the saw on. Then I raised it up just enough to make a mark. This will give me a reference point to measure from in order to have the tracks equal distance from the blade. This might have been mistake number two. Although it worked out, I feel like I should have installed the runners first and then done this install. It would have made things a lot easier moving forward. I then set up my dado stack to cut the slot for the T-tracks. Most of these tracks are 3/4 inches wide with varying heights. I set the height, cut the first slot, and then flipped it over to repeat that on the other side. Then I test fit the tracks and cut them down the length on the miter saw. Cutting through these aluminum tracks is very easy, but I wouldn't use your nicest blade if you can avoid it. I then drilled some pilot holes and secured the tracks with number 6 screws. I cut them down to ensure that they did not protrude from the bottom side. Mistake number 3. I should have taken a little more off. Although the screw didn't actually go through the bottom, the pressure did cause damage to the melamine surface, which created some holes. I grabbed my grinder and made sure nothing was going to touch the table saw's surface. Oh well. Next it was time to install the runners. I'm giving these plastic runners that were 3D printed a try. They were very inexpensive from a guy on the Shop Hacks page. I used dimes as spacers to keep the bottom of the runners from actually resting on the table saw itself, and then align the runners. I'm using CA glue for this part. Since I should have done this first and didn't, I need to raise the blade up so I can line up the center of the sled with the blade. I will then lower it into place. Once the front of the sled is flush with the front of the saw, I put some weight on it and let the glue dry. While the runners are setting up, I continued working on the fences. I cut a small chamfer on the inside of the front fence for sawdust relief, and then I softened the edges of the rear fence with a roundover bit. Once the glue was set up on the runners, I drilled some pilot holes and secured the runners with screws. Then it was time for a test run on the table saw, which failed. It bound up terribly. I tried some adjustments, but these runners were simply not going to work for this application. Although, I think they would work great for a single runner jig. I was about to run to Woodcraft and purchase the adjustable metal runners when I remembered I had some 3/4 inch rabbet cutoffs from earlier. I located those pieces, measured the runner gap, and cut them down to size. I have a hard time spending $50 on runners when I had some good hardwood pieces sitting around. If I have issues later with expansion or anything like that, I may consider swapping them out, but for now, I'll go with the hardwood. I then placed some glue on the new runners and then realized I forgot to put the dime spacers in place. With the spacers in place, I then repeated the steps from before, but this time I used tight bond wood glue. I drilled pilot holes and added a countersink to ensure no screws made contact with the table saw. The sled fit okay, but I did have to sand a few spots to achieve the perfect fit. Before moving on to installing the fences, I had to figure out how the T-track attachments will be able to enter the track for my other jigs. I thought about cutting a slot out of the rear fence like Nick Ferry did over on his channel, but I wanted to try simply notching out each track first. Also, I have a ton of these panhead bolts, so I flattened two sides enough to fit into the track. And this way you have an inexpensive alternative to buying T-slot accessories. Now it's time to install the fences. I started with the rear fence. It doesn't need to be any more accurate than just flush with the rear of the sled base. Just like before, I pre-drilled pilot holes and added a countersink. I was careful not to put any screws near where the blade will cut through. After the rear fence was installed, I sanded it down with some 220 grit sandpaper. I plan on putting some sort of finish on it because it's walnut and it deserves it. I then took the sled over to the table saw, raised the blade as high as it would go, and cut 80% of the way across the sled. You need to have a good blade line in order to align the front fence. Using a square to get it as accurate as possible, I installed one screw on the right side of the fence, making sure to mark it so that you can see it after the fence is installed, and then one screw on the left. More screws will be added later after the sled is calibrated using the 5-cut method. I then finished cutting through the remaining section of the sled. With the sled completely assembled, I will now calibrate the front fence utilizing the 5-cut method. I highly suggest you check out William Ng's video on this method for the full breakdown. There will be a link below. Through a miracle, my fence was accurate to 0.03 of an inch right off the bat without any adjustment at all. Some say it should be within 0.001 of an inch, but I am fine with these results. I then wipe off the dry erase and move on. I love that feature. I cleaned up the bottom with some 600 grit sandpaper, and then I applied some paste wax. The sled slides pretty well. I'm happy with it. Next was to install the Craig swing stop and self-adhering tape measures. I put one on each side. There's a left to right reading and a right to left reading. I marked the 1-inch location on the sled, and I moved the stop into place. Now you can adjust the sight glass to the correct measurement. At this point, the sled itself is fully assembled, and it's time to make the 45-degree miter jig. I grabbed another piece of melamine and I cut it down to size. I then figured out how I was going to lay it out and cut one side using the miter bar, and then I cut the other side on my brand new CrossCut Sled. I also decided to wrap this in walnut as well. So I cut the jig a little short to accommodate for the walnut trim pieces that will be on the edge. And then I took the walnut trim pieces over to the miter saw to cut them down. I then set up the dado stack in order to put the T-slot tracks into the jig. Since I didn't want to cut all the way through, I cleaned it up with a chisel. Once the tracks were all cut out, I used the number 6 screws again to secure them down. However, I did learn my lesson this time, and I cut them down even further. Next, I aligned the holes for the knobs, and then glued the trim onto the jig. With the jig complete, I installed it onto the sled and then cut the slot for the blade girth. I then accomplished some test cuts, and I'm very happy with the result. The track clamp is going to be a nice addition. I feel as though it's going to be a lot safer cutting smaller pieces, and this way, using the sled, it'll be really accurate as well. My last concern is where the blade protrudes through the back of the front fence. Although your hand should never be that close to the blade, it would be nice to have a safety feature there to protect against complacency. I decided to make a basic box that will secure into the front fence and have a plexiglass top to view the blade through. I made another mistake while cutting this piece, but I like it being there just to remind me that mistakes happen and that's okay. I ended up putting a coat of poly on the walnut and then I got to work using my new sled. Overall, I am very pleased with the way that this turned out, and I truly hope that you learned something from this, and that you're inspired to make your own sled. The total cost was around $90, not counting anything I had on hand, like the walnut. If you have any suggestions of things that I can do better, please leave some constructive comments below. And also, please consider subscribing below and ring that bell so that way you get notified whenever I provide new content. It really helps me out when you do this. This has been Paul with Build It or Bust, and thanks so much for watching.